I think we will get started. We've got a few people on the call, so thanks so much for joining us this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. Um, just letting you know that this webinar is recorded. We don't have your videos or anything. If you want to introduce yourself, you can do so in the chat. And if you have any questions, you can pop those in the Q&A. We will get to those at the end of the session. We've left plenty of time for questions. We may not actually have a chat. So you can use the Q&A function for questions or for anything that you want to share with us while we're going through the webinar. All right, I'm just going to share my screen. And before we get into it, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and sea country and pay our respects to elders past and present. Um, I'm calling in, all of our presenters are calling in from Meanjin, Brisbane today. So we've got Toby Hutcheon on the call, who is the campaign manager for Boomerang Alliance. Myself, Tara Jones from the Australian Marine Conservation Society, and we've got Hannah from the Australian Marine Conservation Society as well. So we're all calling in from Meanjin, Brisbane, and we all pay our respects to traditional owners that are on the call and elders past and present. We acknowledge that this land and sea was and always will be Aboriginal land and sea. So this is a pretty quick webinar. We're not going to keep you for too long today. We don't want to take up your whole lunchtime. I'm going to run through our Unwrapped supermarket plastics audit and the results from that. Toby's going to give us a bit of a policy update about Australian legislation and policy, and then we'll have time for a Q&A session. So for anyone who's on the call that hasn't been following this project since last year, this is our second year of our project investigating supermarket plastics and packaging. So last year in 2023, we developed Unwrapped, the audit methodology and the framework with the aim of quantifying plastic footprint of supermarkets, assessing any actions and interventions that they're doing to reduce plastic packaging, and also to identify areas for improvement. Now, when I say plastic footprint, by this I mean all of the plastic that supermarkets are generating through their operations. So this is mainly looking at the plastic packaging that you would see on the supermarket shelves, but we're also looking at the plastics that are occurring through the back of house, things like pallet wraps, things like produce crates, anything about shelf displays. So we've taken a really holistic view of this because all of that plastic should be quantified, and that's what we refer to as the plastic footprint of a supermarket. So we wanted to focus on supermarkets because they're a massive industry. They're a $131.7 billion industry. They are all recording record profits year on year. And in Australia, we have a very unique situation where we have very few choices in retailers. So, as I'm sure we're all keenly aware, we have a duopoly of Woolworths and Coles who dominate the majority of the market share. And then we've also included Aldi and Metcash in this assessment as they make up other significant parts of that market share that's held by those four businesses. So Metcash owns IGA and Foodland. They're all independently run stores, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on and why that's important and relevant for this assessment. So we know that plastic pollution is directly linked with plastic production. There's been a couple of studies very recently that have shown the really, really strong linear relationship between plastic production and plastic pollution. This might seem obvious, but what it demonstrates is that end-of-life waste management for plastics and packaging, such as recycling, are not solutions to our plastic pollution crisis. Australia produces more than 1.2 million tonnes of plastic packaging. That's the data for 2021-22 financial year, which is the most up-to-date data that we have. And this represents an 8% increase from the previous year. We have a long history of increase in plastic production, both in Australia and overseas. Of the plastic that's being generated in Australia, around about 145,000 tonnes of that enters the environment every year. So without changes to our business as usual, we're going to see more and more plastic packaging being produced and more of that ending up in our marine environments. Now, when we reached out to supermarkets in 2023, we were met with some resistance to share data. So we asked supporters to go and complete surveys in their local supermarket to try and fill some of those gaps. And after the success of those surveys in 2023, we asked supporters again to investigate their local supermarkets. What we found was that in 73% of cases, the pre-packaged plastic wrapped fresh produce was cheaper than the loose fresh produce. So this financially penalises customers who wish to shop plastic free or those wanting to buy smaller quantities. This was our main finding, which the media was incredibly interested in, and it's all thanks to our supporters who completed surveys in their local shops. So if you're on this call and you did some of those surveys, massive, massive thank you to you. We couldn't have done this without you. This was such an important finding, and the supermarkets were not prepared to give us this information. So this shows the results from our first ever audit in 2023. Aldi came out on top with 20%, followed by Coles, Woolworths, and Metcash. Aldi had the best reporting in 2023. They had a separate report that looked at plastics and packaging specifically, as well as their annual sustainability report. Coles provided very minimal data, but they did have some good reuse initiatives, although very few of them. Woolworths provided no data, and everything that we assessed them on was publicly available information from sustainability reports and media releases. And Metcash gave us no data at all, and they took minimal responsibility for their packaging, which I'll talk about more in a little bit. Now, if we skip over to 2024, and I'm sorry that the formatting's a little bit different, this is our overall scores on the right-hand side, you can see that Woolworths and Metcash have both come up from the bottom to the top this year. And that's because they were providing far more data to provide evidence for plastic reductions. So Woolworths provided us with data that showed actual reductions across some problematic plastics, but they still didn't provide us with their overall plastic footprint data, nor did any of the other supermarkets. Metcash provided us with a lot more data, and we engaged a lot more frequently with them. Coles provided some data, very fragmented, and Aldi has dropped from first place in 2023 to last place in 2024. And in fact, they couldn't be assessed for an overall score because they haven't yet published their sustainability report. Now, Woolworths, Metcash, and Coles all report on a financial year, which means that their reporting period that we're assessing ended at the end of June this year, 2024. Aldi reports on a calendar year. Their reporting period ended in December 2023, and they still haven't published their sustainability report on that data. So this is a serious lack of transparency from Aldi, and without it, we can't assess what they're doing to reduce plastic packaging. So supermarkets were assessed on 5 major categories. Now, these are the same as last year. So we looked at transparency, plastic footprint reduction, reusables, recycling and recycled content, and policy planning and governance. Now, if you look in the far right column, you'll see that these are given a weighting. This weighting is designed based on giving the most importance to actions that will reduce plastic pollution and plastic packaging. So the plastic footprint reduction was given the most weighting at 40%, followed by reusables and recycle. And then transparency, policy planning, and governance had a weighting of just 10%. So for transparency, Woolworths was the only supermarket that provided enough data or had enough publicly available information to receive a score in 2024. It's a welcome change from 2023 because they are the largest supermarket by market share. And what this demonstrates is that the pressure we're putting on the supermarkets is working. This is from 2023, where Woolworths refused to engage with us and refused to provide data, to this year, providing the most amount of data and demonstrating a higher level of transparency than we saw in 2023. In this section, points were available for supermarkets who provided actual data on the volume of plastic packaging in some sections. This was regardless of whether it was going up or down. We wanted to reward transparency for providing actual numbers. The next section we had is for plastic reduction. This is the heaviest weighted section, the most important, the most impactful. While Woolworths come out on top here for sharing more data than their competitors, it's really important to note again that none of these supermarkets have provided us with their overall plastic footprint. So while Woolworths demonstrated evidence that they've removed and reduced some problematic plastic items as identified by APCO, and this is that smaller table in the bottom, we can't tell whether they're increasing their plastic use in other parts of the business. So they've made decent progress in removing some of these problematic and unnecessary plastic packaging items as defined by APCO. APCO is the Australian Packaging and Covenant Organisation and is in charge of setting and managing the 2025 national packaging targets and providing advice to businesses to help to reduce their packaging waste. So Woolworths demonstrated the most evidence of removing and reducing these items, but we don't know what their plastic packaging footprint looks like overall, and that's the same with all of the other supermarkets. In our reuse and refill section, points were awarded for reusable packaging. And in this instance, this is mainly packaging that customers aren't seeing on the shelf. It's things like produce crates for meat and for fresh produce and seafood. Coles gained some points for allowing customers in South Australia to bring their own container to the deli for some items. And for this period that we're assessing, they also had their Swapper Box trial for home delivery, which has since ended. So 2025 is going to look a little bit differently as this trial is no longer in place. In terms of recycling, again, Woolworths has come out on top. Woolworths has a target to reduce virgin plastic by 50%. And so they report on their recycled content in their plastic packaging, where most of the other supermarkets don't provide this level of detail. So we're really happy that Woolworths does have a target for plastic reduction, but the fact that it only applies to virgin plastic means that they can be increasing their plastic use elsewhere in the business and saying that because it's recycled plastic, that it's okay, it's justified. And we know that the best way to reduce marine plastic pollution is to reduce plastic production overall. Finally, our policy planning and governance section. This is all about the policies at the store or company level aimed at reducing waste, as well as staff training for reducing waste and increasing resource recovery. This was only weighted at 10% because this is where supermarkets talk the talk. But as we've seen from previous sections, it doesn't always translate into tangible action. So that is just a very quick rundown of the results from our 2024 audit. There's plenty of opportunities for questions later on. So if there's something that you're unsure about that I haven't covered, feel free to ask that in the Q&A section. And now I'm going to hand over to Toby. Toby's the campaign manager at the Boomerang Alliance, and I'll let Toby talk a little bit about domestic policy.
Okay, thank you, Tara, and I hope everyone can hear me all right. So our supermarket audit is obviously our attempt to keep pressure on the supermarkets and others to take a more sustainable approach to their packaging, particularly plastic packaging. The other thing that supermarkets will pay attention to, of course, is government policies. So for the last 7 or 8 years, we've had state governments gradually eliminating problem single-use plastics such as straws and cutlery, etc. But a lot of that has been about away from home takeaway issues. What we've always really needed is some sort of national approach to packaging to make sure that the packaging that we use is actually going to be collected and recovered rather than thrown away and littered. Unfortunately, after 25 years of looking at this in this country, it's still a sad fact that most of the single-use plastics in packaging that we use end up either in landfill or is littered. Very little is actually recovered. So we need that change. So this year, the Commonwealth Government released its proposed packaging reforms. And they've suggested three options for that reform. The first one is about maintaining the current policies, which is a voluntary program by the industry to actually reduce their packaging. The second one is to have a program where governments will introduce mandatory targets and other bans on those problematic plastics. And the third one is to have what's called an extended producer responsibility or product stewardship scheme for packaging. This is a scheme whereby producers will be held responsible for the packaging they put into the market. So what AMCS and the Boomerang Alliance did this year is we supported that option 3 for an extended producer responsibility scheme, because we think that is the real answer to all these problems. But we've also suggested that option 2, which is the mandatory targets, should also be included in that. At the moment, the Commonwealth has received all the comments from the public and from industry, and we're now in a position of waiting for their response, which we would hope will come out in early 2025, because the notion is that these reforms need to be put in place by 2026. But of course, we've got a federal election coming up in sometime before May, so it may well affect the timing. We're not quite sure. But that's the position that we're in right now on policy generally. Tara could have the next. Okay, so this is what we are wanting to see from any policy. The first thing is that option 3, a producer responsibility scheme, where producers pay the full costs of collection and recovery. Now, extended producer responsibility or product stewardship schemes are basically designed to deliver a certain outcome, whatever that might be, to involve all the producers who put products into the market, and then to organize, to create a fund so that the design, the use, and particularly the collection, recovery, and return to market of all their products is costed. So it effectively means that instead of householders paying for the recycling of packaging through curbside, producers would need to contribute to local government for that service. And then they would also be then responsible for its recovery, etc. So it's a big change, but it's the change that will be effective, because as far as we're concerned, if a producer has to pay the costs, they will make sure it all happens. A good example of this is the container refund scheme. If you take away the notion of the refund, the beverage industry is responsible for the collection and the recovery of their beverage containers and ensure that they're recycled. So that's a good example of what a product stewardship scheme can produce. The second thing that we're looking for are mandated targets. We've had targets for 25 years on recycling and recycled content. They never get met. So what we're asking for is regulated and mandated targets on, first of all, plastic reduction, which doesn't exist, on reuse, on recycling and composting, and recycled content. So if you link those two things, a producer responsibility scheme with mandated targets, those are the outcomes you're hoping to achieve. So those are the two key things that we're hoping will be announced next year. The third thing is really about accurate consumer labeling. Many of you would have noticed and paid attention to the problems with the Australian recycling label. That's the label that you see on a lot of plastic wrapping. Traditionally, it's suggested that, for instance, the plastic wrapping can be returned to store for recycling, despite the fact that the Red Cycle scheme no longer exists. So what we want is accuracy and honesty in labeling. So as part of all this, what we were seeking to have is, if you're going to put on a label on a product, it needs to be recovered in practice. So that means if it's a reusable product, it needs to be reused. If it's a compostable product, it needs to be composted. And if it's a recyclable product, it needs to be recycled in practice. That label will ensure that the producers are actually meeting their targets and taking responsibility for how their products are managed. So those three things are all interlinked. And if we get them right, we're going to change the way that we handle and manage packaging, particularly plastic packaging, for the future. A lot of you have also talked about soft plastics. Currently, virtually all soft plastics are being landfilled, or if you look at the recent Clean Up Australia report, it's now the #1 littered item. Soft plastics are the #1 littered item in Australia, representing 34% of all litter. So it's become a major, major problem. So the last thing that we're asking for is an industry-funded product stewardship scheme for soft plastics that will collect soft plastics once again and be introduced in 2025. We have the Australian Food and Grocery Council, who have got a proposal scheme in place now, where they are proposing that the industry will actually do this. And so our call now to the Commonwealth and to the state governments is to let this happen. When it's in place, the Food and Grocery Council are proposing that there will be a number of ways you can collect soft plastics. One would be through curbside, through special arrangements in your curbside bin. That's the recycling bin. The second option would be being able to return your soft plastics to the store. And the third one would be a self-haul option to a recycling depot, or maybe a container refund scheme depot. Those are the three options that are now being proposed. And lastly, before I hand back to Tara, many of you have registered your concerns that you've got all this soft plastics that you've been collecting because you didn't want to put it to waste. So we've formally asked the industry to arrange a return to store day for supermarkets. We've asked for that to be done in early 2025. We haven't had a response yet, but as soon as we do, we're very, very keen to have all the supermarkets organize a return to store day for the soft plastics so they can be collected and recycled and get them out of your houses where they're obviously accumulating a lot of space. That's it from me, Tara.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Toby. So we've talked now about the 2024 audit process and about what's happening in Australia regarding legislation. But we know that businesses are pushing hard to continue their wasteful business practices and that they won't change unless they're forced to. So how can we force them to change? Now, there's two stakeholder groups that businesses care about above all else, and that's shareholders and customers. All of the supermarkets mention in their feedback from their customers in their annual reports. And this is really important because they collect and share this feedback to their shareholders and they report on it in their annual reports. So, for example, Coles has recognised that sustainability of our products, including packaging and sourcing, is the number one issue according to customers. Aldi says we know our customers want us to reduce our emissions and see us use less waste and plastic. Woolworths admits that customers are at the heart of our business. Our customers prioritise better value and better shopping experiences. We know value can mean different things, and across our connected group, we work to provide our customers with greater value and a greater range. So they really care about customers and they really care about what you think and they care about what this public image is for them. So we've set up an action on our webpage. Hopefully you can see that QR code. It's a bit funny on my screen here. The QR code will take you to our website where we've set up an action for you to tell the supermarkets that you don't want to be charged more for loose fresh produce and that you want to see plastic packaging reduced. I don't think you can see this QR code, which is very annoying. Hopefully you can see the URL. Which is marineconservation.org.au/actions/unwrap our food. I will share this URL at the end of the webinar. We'll send out some resources at the end. Apologies, I think it's my internet that's being frustrating. So what we're recommending on this action page is for you to call your supermarkets and have your say. On the page, there's a lot of tips about what you can include, but we recommend for you to make it your own. And if calling is not accessible to you, there's plenty of other options that you can contact your supermarkets. So Aldi doesn't actually accept any phone calls, so we recommend contacting them through their general feedback form. And you can also reach out to Coles and Metcash using a feedback form and Woolworths using a chatbot. They're also quite sensitive about their social media. So if you're an avid social media user, I would recommend snapping some pictures in your supermarket and tagging your supermarkets, telling them that you want to see them do better. You can also send them a direct message on social media. They check those as well. I wanted to just mention really briefly here about this action, the importance of Metcash and their different business model. So Metcash owns the IGA brand and the Foodland brand and a number of different brands like that. And each of those stores is independently owned. So this means that business owners, store owners, can decide which products they stock in their stores. So for this reason, the best feedback that you can give to Metcash is that you want to see them improve their own brand packaging. Now, own brand packaging is the supermarket's home brand. For Metcash, it's things like Black and Gold and Community Co. Coles and Woolworths also have a range of own brands, and Aldi has heaps and heaps of home brands. Because of something called a supermarket code of conduct, supermarkets say they're unable to tell their suppliers what to do, and this extends to packaging as well. So supermarkets are very hesitant to accept responsibility for branded products in their stores, but what they do have control over directly is their own brand products and packaging. So if you're contacting supermarkets, if you're snapping a picture of packaging in the supermarkets that's frustrating you, I recommend that you take those pictures of own brand products. And there are plenty of examples, particularly in fresh produce. So these are products and packaging that the supermarkets have direct control over. And I encourage you to contact them and say that you want to see them do better and reduce their plastic packaging. So we have about 15 minutes left of this webinar. We have plenty of time to take your questions. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen and I'll pass over to Hannah and see whether we've had any questions asked of us so far.
So no, not yet. So please do take advantage of that Q&A function, everybody. Tara and Toby are a font of knowledge, so this is a really good opportunity for you to dive into their brains. Just to kick us off, though, we do have a question that was sent through ahead, which has been touched on a little bit, but I'd love to just hear a little bit more about what role does the government have in plastic reduction and how that ties into all of this.
Yeah, Toby, do you want to take that question?
Okay, well, it comes back to the notion of producer responsibility. So The government is now proposing, and I need to say that we talked about those three options about the current arrangements, bringing in certain bans, and then extended producer responsibility. You need to know that the majority of submissions supported that option 3, extended producer responsibility. Now, the role of the government would be to bring that in, to mandate targets, and then require businesses, the packaging industry, to sort out a scheme. This is very much how the container refund schemes work, and that would be their role, and then to ensure that all those outcomes then get met, so that in the future we are reducing plastic packaging, we are reusing it, we are recycling it, and we are reusing it back in the economy. So that would be the central role of the Commonwealth Government, as well as bringing in certain regulated targets for the EPR scheme.
Thanks, Toby. Really helpful, thorough answer there. So also we've got some other questions that are filtering through. So this is an interesting one. So what were you most surprised with for the 2024 results from the report?
That is a good question. I think the most surprising finding for me was the fact that supermarkets continue to charge more for loose fresh produce, despite the fact that a number of food charities recommend that supermarkets sell produce loose. And this is coming from a food waste perspective, not a packaging waste perspective. Their reasoning for this is that customers, if they're able to buy loose, they can choose just what they need for their household. So smaller households or households that are using less of certain produce at the moment are penalised financially by the kilo for foregoing plastic packaging and for buying just what they need. We're concerned that customers are having to pay more for that. And we're worried that if people are needing to look at their budgets very closely, they might be drawn into these savings per kilo. But this could be costing the consumer more in the end if they're wasting that food and contributing to food waste as well. And this finding is something that we found in 2023. And we recommended that the supermarkets change their policies and implement policies, in fact, to make sure that their produce is cost competitive, loose versus prepackaged. And unfortunately, we didn't see that happen this year. And the supermarkets had very little responses to why this practice occurs. So this is the really big call that we're asking for you to contact the supermarkets and say that you want to see this be affordable and be cost competitive across packaged and loose fresh produce.
Thanks, Tara. I'll add another question that I think tacks on a little bit. Someone's asked if you'll be doing the same report again next year and whether they'll be able to participate in the shopper surveys.
Absolutely and absolutely. Having customers going out and doing these surveys has been a massive help contributing to the data that the supermarkets aren't willing to share with us. And it helps to shed light on things like, these pricing disparities. We also had people looking at packaging options so that we could determine whether people have genuine choices in pantry staple products like rice and pasta to buy them plastic free. And what we found from customers is that overwhelmingly, we don't have enough choice. So we will be doing an Unwrapped 2025, and the surveys are actually still live. So they're currently hosted through SurveyMonkey. I will make a note to share that link with you so that you can complete those surveys, and you can do it as many times as you want for as many different products as you want or as many different supermarkets as you want. So the more data we have there, the more valuable that is. And, this is coming from supermarkets customers. It's really, really important information. So a huge thank you again to anyone who did do those surveys. And if you didn't, please join us. They're really quick. They're easy to do just before you do your shopping, and they make a huge impact to this project.
Amazing. Thanks, Tara. Someone else has asked, what phase of the ban are we currently in? They thought that produce bags were being banned already.
Yeah. So Hannah, I can probably answer this question and the next one about life cycle analysis as well. So what you've got to understand is that there's the Commonwealth Government, and then we've got all the state and territory jurisdictions. So the state and territory jurisdictions, to various degrees, are phasing out a lot of what they regard as problematic plastic items, single use. Some have already signaled produce bags will be banned. And what we anticipate is that will be an ongoing program where states and territories ban the products that we've got better alternatives for. So that's currently happening. But what we really need is that change of attitude. And that's what the product stewardship or the EPR schemes are about, changing the practices and habits that we have more generally. And that leads us to that question about life cycle analysis. This is where it all starts. Unfortunately, AMCS and Boomerang Alliance don't have the capacity to do a lot of this life cycle analysis. We require and we need governments and industry to do that. But we anticipate that if we have a scheme like this, they will have to do it. So if you imagine a packaging producer who's putting packaging into the market, they have to answer questions around what material use they're making, what water they're reducing, what greenhouse gas emissions they're reducing, etc., etc. And they also have to answer the question is, are you producing a product that's going to waste? All those questions can feed into a life cycle assessment of that product so that they can decide what is the best product that is fit for service that meets all those requirements. So what we would hope to see is as soon as this is in place, all those manufacturers doing robust life assessments, life cycle assessments on their products to make sure it's the most sustainable option that they can put onto the market. So I hope that answers that question. But carry on with your life cycle assessments. Unfortunately, we, as I say, haven't got the capacity to do that work.
Thank you so much, Toby. I've got another question from Marcella. So amazing work to start with, but she's asked that she would love to know if we provide the supermarkets with packaging options that would be more sustainable, if there's specific items that we think would be easier to be replaced for sustainable materials, and if there's some items which we think are just still really far away from replacing.
That's such a good question. We have had far more engagement with the supermarkets this year. It was really important for us when developing this audit methodology that we weren't just pointing the finger at supermarkets and telling them to do better. We wanted to make sure that we were across some of the options that were available internationally and really help to focus efforts. So one of our key recommendations from this year is for supermarkets to effectively scale up reuse and refill packaging for customers, is to start that at online shopping. So with online shopping and online delivery, there are ample opportunities to provide refillable and reusable containers for things like deli items and dry goods, and also even just crates so that we can do away with single-use bags. It's a really important point about when you mentioned materials. What we really want to see is supermarkets removing packaging that's not necessary, regardless of what material it's made from. So we're really happy to see that those heavyweight and lightweight plastic shopping bags that are single use have been removed and banned. But their replacement is a paper bag that is claimed to be reusable, but if it's not actually being reused, it's not any better. We'd love to see that be done away with and have reusable crates for customers so that there aren't any bags at all. And we'd love to see options for plastic reduction in online shopping. So we have spoken with the supermarkets about these recommendations. And we've also highlighted some really key things that are happening internationally, particularly around the reusable and refillable space. But the other thing that we're calling for supermarkets to do is to remove plastic packaging in fresh produce unless they can prove that their packaging decreases food waste. And I want to be clear about the difference between decreasing food waste and increasing shelf life, which doesn't necessarily lead to a decrease in food waste. This is another recommendation from a UK-based food waste charity. They've put the onus on the supermarkets to prove that their packaging reduces food waste. And we've asked all of the supermarkets to provide that. None of them have provided us with any of their own research or suggested that they do that research at all. And only Metcash provided us with a handful of peer-reviewed papers about packaging and food waste. So the supermarkets are claiming things like shelf life and food waste as reasons to keep this packaging, but they have no evidence to back that up. So that's what we're really calling for is that in the first instance is removal of plastic packaging, particularly in home delivery and fresh produce, unless they can prove that they need it to reduce food waste overall.
Yeah. And if I can add to Tara's comments, we run a program called Plastic Free Places that we do precisely what the questioner has asked. And that is we work with cafes and other places to help them switch to better alternatives. We feed all that information through Tara to the supermarkets where it's relevant. And so we would love it if the supermarkets were to come to our organizations and say, can you help us? Because we can provide them with a whole suite of alternatives that are better than what they're currently doing.
Thanks, Tara and Toby. I think this next question is quite connected to that one as well. So Phoebe, noting your comments, Tara, that supermarkets are hesitant to require changes of their suppliers, do you see there being any avenues for supermarkets to put pressure on suppliers for change? So going beyond their targeting their own brand and hoping that what they do can influence other suppliers.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Supermarkets at the moment are under a lot of scrutiny for things like accusations of price gouging and their conduct with their suppliers. So at the moment, they will throw their hands up and say that they have absolutely no control over the branded products that are stocked in their supermarket. But what we've been calling for is stronger packaging guidelines for suppliers, which all of the supermarkets have, but they're not always as strongly worded or enforced as they could be. And we would also say that the supermarkets really should lead by example with their own brand packaging and demonstrate that some of this packaging is just completely unnecessary and others can be significantly reduced. And then I would also encourage you, if you buy branded products and you look at it and say, this is a ridiculous amount of packaging. I've got a phone full of images that drive me crazy. Contact the brands as well as the supermarkets and tell them that you want them to do better. This is a real power as customers. Like I said earlier, they do listen to their customers and they listen to their shareholders. So any opportunities that we have to voice our concerns and tell them what we want to see, if we can do that in volume, they will have to act. And we've seen a lot of examples where shareholders and customers have put pressures on brands recently, and it's led to some really great outcomes. So I would say jump on the phone, jump on the email, jump on their website, give them feedback as much as often as you can, and be really clear about what the problem is and what you want to see done about it.
Yeah. There is general recognition now in the whole sector that things have got to change, whether you're a supermarket or a brand. So now's the time that we can drive that change. And as Tara was saying, part of it is customer lobbying. To get them to change. But the other part, of course, is that government policies that will drive that change. The combination can get us to a better outcome.
Thanks,
Toby.
Sounds like
we've
add
actually
something to that, sorry?
No, I was just going to say that we've actually reached our webinar time. So I'm very conscious of not keeping people any longer. Hannah, were there any questions that we didn't get to that we haven't answered yet?
There was one great one from Denise regarding what role local government plays in sort of the grand scheme of soft plastic recycling, soft plastic packaging.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because local government are the ones that deal with our waste. Toby, do you want to talk about this one with local government?
Yes. Well, right now, what is being proposed by the Food and Grocery Council is that curbside recycling would be part of soft plastics collections. That's still to be worked out what the arrangements are. But what they're suggesting is that the brand owners, which will include the supermarkets, will fund the collection of soft plastics. And the three means of collection are curbside, in-store collection, and self-haul, depending upon the circumstances. So that's one way that local government can be involved. But obviously local government have got to ensure that their ratepayers aren't getting ripped off by any type of service. So that's something that the Food and Grocery Council and local governments are currently talking about, because local government are very, very important in making all this happen and making it work effectively.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Toby. And thank you so much, everyone, for sticking around and for all of your great questions. We will send out some post-webinar resources with the links that, unfortunately, you couldn't view. I do encourage you to check out the action. So you can go to marineconservation.org.au/actions/unwrap-our-food and make some calls to supermarkets. There's a very short survey when you leave this webinar as well about whether you've made a call like that. And if not, what are the main barriers that might be stopping you, so that we can make sure that we're passing on as much feedback as possible to the supermarkets and drive really strong action. We know that what we've been doing has been really working, and we thank each and every one of you for your support. We can't do it without you. So thanks again. And look out for an email from us tomorrow with some resources, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. Well done, Tara. Thank you, Hannah.